The war had a way of teaching you to wait. For letters, for news, for mornings that didn't hurt to wake up to. Maybe that's why I didn't panic the moment I saw the empty platform. Just a long stretch of tracks gleaming under the late afternoon light, the train already gone. I stood there with my suitcase and my heart somewhere between disappointment and quiet acceptance. 3 years of nursing in field hospitals across France and Germany had taught me that sometimes life didn't follow timetables. Still, I couldn't help feeling small in that silence, the kind of quiet that only train stations know after the whistle fades and the dust hasn't yet settled. Elmwood Station was the sort of place you might miss if you blink from the window of a passing train. A single bench, a ticket window with peeling paint, and a wooden clock that ticked for minutes fast. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and coffee, the kind that sits too long on a hot plate. The station master had already gone home. Only one man remained, kneeling beside a cart of tools near the freight track. He looked up briefly when he heard my footsteps, his face half-shadowed under the brim of his cap. "Evening, ma'am," he said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag. "You missed the 4:15. Bound east, wasn't it?" I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Seems I did. Next one's not till morning," he said, glancing toward the horizon. "You can wait inside if you'd like. Gets chilly once the sun drops." I thanked him and stepped into the waiting room. The air was cool, the kind that carried a hint of iron and dust. Wooden benches lined the walls, and a single bulb hummed above. Flickering every few seconds, a pot-belly stove sat in the corner. Long since gone cold, I set down my suitcase and rubbed my hands together. After years of sleeping wherever I could, tents, barns, hospital corridors, the hard bench felt almost familiar. I was heading home at last, to a small apartment that still smelled, in my mind, of lilacs and soap. But home felt like a word I hadn't used in a while. The man from the platform came in a few minutes later, carrying a tin thermos and 2 paper cups. "Coffee?" he asked, with the hesitant kindness of someone who's not sure if an offer will be welcome. "Please," I said, smiling. The warmth was a comfort more than the taste. He sat across from me, the light catching on the edge of his jaw where a faint scar traced downward toward his collar. I recognized it instantly, the mark of someone who'd seen something sharp and fast too close. Soldiers had those scars. So did nurses. "Train trouble?" I asked. "Always," he said. "Freight engine blew a gasket a few miles out. They sent word for me to stay behind in case another one passes through. I guess you and I are the only ones keeping the place open tonight." He didn't introduce himself right away, and I didn't press. There was something easy about the silence between us, the kind of stillness tired people share when they've already used up all their words somewhere else. Outside, the sun slipped below the hills, painting the rails in gold. I watched the light fade and listened to the rhythmic ticking of the clock. "Funny thing about trains," he said after a while. "They never really stop. Even when you think you've missed one, it's still moving, somewhere." I turned to him. "That's a comforting thought." He gave a quiet chuckle. "Maybe. Or maybe it just means some things aren't meant to wait for us." The wind rattled the window panes. I pulled my coat tighter. "You sound like a man who's missed a few." He looked down at his hands, turning the empty cup slowly. Just one that mattered. Something in the way he said it made me want to look away. The room grew still again, the only sound the faint hum of the light and the distant echo of a train far off in the night, one I couldn't see, but could somehow feel moving through the dark. "I suppose I'll wait until morning," I said softly. He nodded. "You can use the cot in the office if you'd like. I'll be round, making sure the lines stay clear. Storm's coming in." I thanked him again and leaned back, closing my eyes. The coffee still warmed my hands. As I drifted toward sleep, I heard him humming, a low, almost tuneless sound that reminded me of the soldiers who used to sing quietly before surgeries. Something about it was steady, grounding. Outside, the wind began to rise. Somewhere down the tracks, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the empty rails, and for a moment, I thought about how strange it was. Missing something only to find something else entirely. That was the night I met Thomas Reed. And though I didn't know it then, missing that train was the best thing that ever happened to me. The storm rolled in slow, like a sigh over the hills. By the time the first drops hit the tin roof of the station, Thomas had already lit the small stove in the corner. It crackled with the comforting sound of dry wood catching flame, filling the room with the faint scent of smoke and warmth. I sat on the bench by the window, watching the rain gather on the glass, tracing uneven lines down to the sill. The trains were done for the night. The world outside had gone quiet except for the thunder that came and went like distant artillery. Thomas moved easily through the small room, the way men do when they've spent a lifetime in one place. He hung his jacket on the back of a chair, rolled up his sleeves, and set another log on the fire. His movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of grace you only notice when everything else has gone still. "Doesn't usually rain this hard in April," he said, glancing toward the window. I smiled faintly. "Maybe it waited for me to come home," he chuckled. "Then I suppose we should thank you. Haven't had a good storm in months." He poured more coffee from the dented thermos and offered it to me. It wasn't fresh, but it was hot, and the gesture meant more than the taste. For a while, neither of us spoke. The kind of silence that fell between us wasn't heavy. It was steady, familiar. Too tired to fill every space with words. I had grown used to the constant noise of the hospitals, men calling out, the clatter of trays, the hum of engines, and fear. This quiet felt new. He sat across from me, elbows resting on his knees, watching the flame dance in the stove's small window. "Been gone a long time?" he asked finally. "3 years," I said softly. "Europe." He nodded once, slowly. "You a nurse?" "Yes, field hospitals, mostly." I stopped keeping track of where we were after the first year. He took a slow sip of coffee. I stayed behind. "They said mechanics were needed here to keep the supply trains running. Never saw a battlefield." But I heard it every night over the radio. There was no shame in his voice, just honesty. I found that rare, a kind of quiet dignity that didn't need to prove itself. "I think everyone fought their own war," I said. "Some with guns, some with waiting." He looked up then, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was something there, a recognition, maybe, of someone who understood what it meant to lose and keep living anyway. Outside, thunder rolled closer. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied again. My father used to say, he began, "The hardest part of any storm is when you start believing it'll never end." I smiled, tired but real. "Sounds like a man who's seen a few." "He was a railroad man," Thomas said. "Knew every track from here to Chicago. Used to tell me stories about the passengers, who they were, where they were going." He said people always show their truest selves at train stations. I tilted my head. "How so?" "They're either leaving something behind," he said, "or waiting for something to come back." The words stayed with me long after he said them. We talked until the fire burned low, about small things, ordinary things. His mother's apple pie recipe, the time he almost lost a finger fixing a coupling, the way the station clock always ran a few minutes fast. I told him about my brother, who had gone missing in 1944 and never come home, and how I had stopped checking the mail after a while because the silence had started to feel like an answer. Thomas didn't say sorry. He just nodded, and somehow, that was enough. When the clock struck midnight, he stood and offered me his coat. "The office cot's not much," he said, "but it's softer than the bench." I smiled, shaking my head. "You dig it. I've slept in worse places." He didn't argue. He simply draped the coat over the back of the bench before walking out to check the tracks one last time. The wind followed him in, bringing the smell of rain and iron. When he returned, his hair was damp, his cap pulled low. "Freight's clear," he said quietly. "Nothing coming till morning." He sat down again, closer this time, both of us drawn toward the fading warmth of the stove. The sound of the rain softened to a steady rhythm, gentle, almost like breathing. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Not because of where I was, but because of who was near. He glanced at the clock and smiled faintly. "We've still got a few hours till sunrise." "Good," I said, leaning back. "I'm not in a hurry anymore." He laughed quietly, and for the rest of the night, we said very little. The fire dimmed, the rain eased, and the world seemed to shrink to the size of that small room. And somewhere between the ticking clock and the sound of the storm, I realized something I hadn't in years. I wasn't waiting for the train anymore. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving behind a world rinsed clean and still. The clouds hung low and pale, and a thin mist curled above the tracks outside the window. I woke to the soft scrape of metal, Thomas, stoking the last embers in the stove, coaxing a little more warmth from the dying fire. He turned when he heard me stir. "Morning," he said softly, voice rough from sleep. "Morning," I echoed. For a moment, neither of us moved. The light coming through the glass was thin and gray, painting his face in a soft outline. He poured the last of the coffee into the tin cups, handed me one, and nodded toward the platform. "Passenger train's due in 20 minutes, he said. Heading east, it took me a second to remember. Home, the reason I was there in the first place. Funny how something so important could feel so distant after just one night. I nodded and managed a small smile. "So, this is goodbye then," he shrugged lightly. "Seems that way." Outside, the world smelled of wet earth and coal smoke. The early morning light touched the rails like silver thread. Thomas opened the door, and the cool air rushed in, crisp, new, and alive. I followed him onto the platform, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. The station was empty, save for a single bench and the wooden clock that still ran for minutes fast. The silence between us wasn't awkward now. It felt like something shared, something neither of us wanted to end too quickly. He stood by the edge of the platform, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the horizon where the faint sound of the coming train was beginning to stir. "Funny," he said quietly. "How time feels slower when you actually have somewhere to be." I smiled. "Or maybe it's just kinder when you don't." He looked at me then, really looked, the kind of look that feels like a conversation in itself. I wanted to remember that expression, to hold it somewhere safe for the days that would come after. "You'll be home soon," he said. "Yes," I said, though the word didn't sound as certain as it should have. The sound of the train grew louder, a distant hum, then a steady rhythm, the rails beginning to tremble. I reached into my pocket and felt the small square of cloth ID carried through the war, a pale blue handkerchief embroidered with my initials, frayed at the edges. I'd used it to wrap bandages, to hold keepsakes, to dry tears that weren't always mine. I pulled it out and looked down at it for a moment before handing it to him. "Keep it," I said. "For luck." He hesitated. "You'll need it more than I will." I shook my head. "I think I've had enough of luck. What I need now is a good reason to believe in timing." He took it then, carefully, as if it were something fragile. His fingers brushed mine. Just for a moment, but enough to make the air feel different. The whistle sounded from down the line, echoing through the valley. The train appeared like a ghost out of the mist, wheels glistening, windows fogged with breath. I lifted my suitcase, suddenly heavier than it had been the night before. "Thank you," I said softly. "For what?" "For waiting out the storm with me." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wasn't waiting for the storm to end, Helen. I was just waiting to see who it might bring in." The train slowed, hissing steam, the air thick with the smell of iron and heat. He helped me lift my bag onto the step, his hand steady at my back. For a moment, I thought he might say something more. Instead, he just nodded once, that quiet, knowing kind of nod that says more than words ever could. I took a seat by the window, and as the train began to move, I looked back. He was still standing there, hands in his pockets, the pale blue handkerchief held loosely in one hand. The wind caught it, fluttering like a small, stubborn flag against the gray morning. Our eyes met one last time through the glass, and I raised my hand in a small wave. He didn't wave back, but he didn't look away either. As the train picked up speed, his figure grew smaller. Until the mist swallowed the station completely, I turned back to the window, watching the landscape blur, fields, trees, the distant line of the horizon. I should have felt relief, I suppose. The war was behind me, and home was ahead. But all I could think about was the quiet man at the station, and the sound of rain against the glass, and how sometimes the smallest detours can change everything. That morning, I left Elmwood Station believing I was leaving something behind. I didn't know then that some goodbyes never really take. Yours have a way of folding in on themselves, like pages in a book you've read too many times. You don't remember every word, just the feeling they left behind. The war ended, and life found its rhythm again. I moved to a small apartment in Chicago, started working at a clinic downtown, and tried my best to settle into the kind of normal life I'd once thought impossible. The sound of trains still drifted in through my window each morning, their whistles faint but familiar, like an old song you can't quite forget. Time passed in the quiet way it does when you stop counting. Letters came and went, birthdays slipped by, faces blurred into memory. But every now and then when it rained I thought of that little station. The wooden clock, the smell of coffee, the man with the steady hands, and the tired eyes who had made one long night feel like the gentlest kind of peace. I never went back. Some memories feel safer left where they belong, in the space between what was and what might have been. It was nearly 15 years later, a mild spring afternoon, when the letter arrived. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting uneven but careful. My name, Miss Helen Moore, written in a style no one used anymore. I turned it over twice before opening it. Inside was a single folded sheet and something else, a small piece of pale blue fabric. My heart stilled. The handkerchief. The letter read, April 12, 1961, Helen. I hope this reaches you, though I can't be sure where you are now. I've kept this with me since the morning you left, the handkerchief you gave me when the train came through Elmwood. It reminded me to believe in small chances, even the ones that seem like accidents. Asterisk, I stayed on at the station all these years. The world changed. New trains, new faces, clocks that run faster and faster. But every spring, when the rain came, I thought of that night, and I waited by the window just in case another train might bring you back. You once said timing is everything. I think you were right. Sometimes the things we miss are the things we were meant to find another way. If you ever find yourself passing through Elmwood again, you'll know where to look. The stove's still warm, the coffee's still terrible, and the clock still runs for minutes fast. Thomas the First read it 3 times before realizing I was crying. The years seemed to slip away as easily as the ink had faded. I could almost hear the rain against the glass again, the hum of the stove, the rhythm of his quiet voice in the half-dark. He had waited. All that time. I folded the letter carefully and held the handkerchief against my palm. The embroidery had frayed nearly to threads, but the initials were still there, HM, as if the years hadn't managed to erase them too. Weeks later, I took the train west, the same route. The same faint smell of coal and oil and early spring air. Elmwood Station hadn't changed much. The paint was more faded, the clock still a few minutes ahead of the world. But the platform was empty. The man at the ticket window told me Thomas had passed the year before, peacefully, in his sleep, in the small room behind the office. He'd left behind very little, a few tools, an old jacket, and a note that simply read, for Helen, if she ever comes. The note was pinned to a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph, the station at sunset, and a cup sitting side by side on the bench by the window. Nothing else. No words needed. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my hands, the sound of the rails humming softly beneath me. Outside, the sky began to change color, that same golden hue I remembered from the night we met. When I finally stood to leave, the clock above the door struck the hour, 4 minutes early. Of course. I smiled through the tears and whispered into the still air, "You were right, Thomas. Timing really is everything." As the train pulled away, I watched the little station disappear into the distance until it was no more than a memory framed in morning light. And I knew, some meetings don't need to happen twice to last forever. If this story reminded you of someone you once met, maybe for a moment, maybe for a lifetime, take a second before you go. Leave a like if it touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in timing, and don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, missing one train is how you find where you were always meant to arrive.